If I had to put together a list of my favourite new IPs from the 7th console generation, the original Dead Space would share a top spot with 2012's Dishonored. It arrived 3 years after Resident Evil 4 laid rock-solid foundations for the third-person survival horror genre, giving Visceral Games time to refine the mechanics, add a dismemberment-based twist to the combat, and wrap it all up in a terrifying audiovisual package. Despite the increasingly dated visuals, I've replayed it many times, and it holds up so well my brain struggles to accept there's been a 15-year gap between it and the release of this remake. With that said, I'll try and explain why I feel Motive has created the definitive version for new and returning players, even if I don't think all the changes are for the best. There'll be some who are looking for a more radical overhaul, but I was pleased Dead Space 2023 only tweaks the plot and fleshes out the cast, without changing major story beats or messing with character motivations. You still move through a dozen named chapters, fixing an absurd number of shipwide problems, while experiencing the same set pieces and shoot the weak spot boss battles. You encounter the same motley group of survivors, most of who perish as expected. Even the alternate ending, unlocked by way of a new game mode collectible hunt, is just a tweaked final cutscene that better sets up the events of Dead Space 2. You could argue it never had a particularly novel plot by sci-fi standards, but the mix of body horror with hard sci-fi concepts, ruthless corporations, authoritarian governments, and sinister religious groups is still compelling. Now that said, the most obvious and significant change to the storytelling is a fully voiced Isaac Clarke, thanks to the return of Gunnar Wright from the sequels. There's a classic plot twist that might justify Isaac's silence, but it was always weird to have the rest of the cast talking at him and issuing instructions without ever questioning his unwillingness or inability to respond. The mission logs were always written from his perspective and gave some insight into his character, yet the only word you'd hear was the odd curse if you repeatedly stomped a necromorph to pieces. In the remake, Isaac often engages with the rest of the cast, highlighting his engineering background or mental state. He actively proposes solutions, repurposing lines that were originally given to the supporting cast despite their non-engineering backgrounds. The dialogue feels plausible enough given the circumstances, but there are several cringeworthy lines that veer a little too close to a cliched action hero script. Thankfully, this remake avoids taking the modern cinematic approach of having a protagonist that undermines the atmosphere by never shutting up. The bulk of the experience is still just the sound of his thudding footfalls, heavy breathing, and beating heart. Now, while the overarching plot may remain the same, Motive clearly wanted the remake to feel a little more coherent with the rest of the trilogy, or at least Dead Space 2, while providing a better time frame for events on the Aegis 7 colony and the Ishimura. It pushes the unitology elements to the forefront with new text and audio logs, expands upon dialogue or encounters with the supporting cast, ramps up the hallucination scenes towards the finale, and introduces side missions that have Isaac tracking hologram recordings to reveal the actions and fate of key crew members. Of course, secret recordings and text logs could be found in the original, but they're expanded upon in the remake, and the side mission structure strings them together in a more coherent order. Some examples include introducing the idea of a convergence event early on, making the influence of the Church of Unitology on corporate entities and individuals more obvious, and giving many crew members, notably Nicole, far more depth and agency during the unfolding disaster. Many of these expanded elements have been covered already in novels, comics, and animated shows, but as someone who hates cross-media storytelling, I'm glad to see them incorporated directly into the game. The newer updated logs even provide some narrative context for an otherwise bland side mission that has you hunt for the rigs of senior crew members to create a master override key. You'll discover more about the fate of the senior crew from their logs, and their bodies are always discovered in a logical location that reflects their final moments. It enhances Dead Space's legacy of incredible environmental storytelling, and ensures the gameplay and narrative feel cohesive. So far, so good. But while Dead Space 2023 keeps the plot intact and smartly expands upon it, I have some issues. The most obvious is the exposition-heavy opening and closing hours. I'm not against expanding the lore and the character backstories, but there's a multi-page text log you can find right after the game starts that takes so long to read you'll miss several important conversations as the rest of the crew walks towards the Ishimura flight lounge. Soon after, you'll find an equally lengthy document covering the CEC Corporation, the Church of Unitology, and EarthGov. Compulsive readers will find it immersion-breaking. Similarly, many expanded conversations clearly lay out the intentions of the different factions, removing much of the mystery and potential for speculation. A more subjective issue is the use of cutscenes for several encounters. Where Dead Space 2008 rarely took control away from the player, the remake does it too often. An early example is the introduction of the infected necromorphs when you explore the morgue. In the original, you watched helplessly as an infector converted a corpse into a slasher necromorph before they both burst through a window to attack Isaac and infect other bodies. In the remake, it's a scripted sequence with a button-mashing QTE before control is finally returned to the player. The same issue crops up during several altered death scenes that both over-explain the narrative and just don't feel as impactful as the original. Leaving the player in control but helpless is a far more effective way of generating terror than these scripted sequences. Now, if you wanted a one-sentence summary of what's changed gameplay-wise, think of Dead Space 2023 as Dead Space 2008, with Dead Space 2's gameplay. That's an oversimplification, but it holds true for the feel of the movement and combat that dominates the experience. Isaac moves faster, shoots faster, and fights scrappier, while the zero-G sections feature free movement using suit thrusters, rather than the clunky jump-to-surface mechanic of the original. Other elements brought in from the sequel include weapon alt-fire modes, replacing several that felt pointless or impractical, and special upgrade nodes that make Isaac's arsenal and rig even more powerful by the endgame. On balance, it was the right choice, as it makes for a more modern and satisfying, dismemberment-focused third-person shooter, even if you excluded the other survival horror elements. It's as fun as it ever was to trap a charging necromorph in a stasis bubble, slice off a bladed limb with a plasma cutter, grab it with the kinesis module, and then fling it back to pin it, or another necromorph, against a wall. There are, of course, additional quality-of-life changes that make for a more streamlined experience. There are typically autosaves before and after every major set piece. The map, although still clunky, is at least usable this time. You start with more inventory slots and unlock even more with each rig upgrade. Power nodes are used exclusively for gear upgrades, and you can spend credits to recover nodes if you want to invest them in another weapon instead. There are some more direct changes, like the way batteries you still need to haul around with kinesis are now associated with circuit breakers that give you a choice of what to deactivate. Think lights or life support, in order to power doors and elevators. Several sections involving the exterior defense turrets, the regenerating hunter necromorph, and environmental hazards have been reworked to be a little less frustrating. It all adds up to create a considerably less clunky Dead Space experience. When it comes to the new content that encourages backtracking, think side missions, security level restricted rooms, master override chests, and the intensity director, it's handled smartly and doesn't feel like excessive padding. The handful of multi-part side missions are clearly tracked and unlocked in a logical order, with many objectives placed in or near locations the story will send you back to. The security level mechanic, which increases as you progress the story, replaces the need to hoard power nodes to open storerooms, and ensures access to new supplies when backtracking in later chapters. The master override doors and containers you can only access in the final hours are also placed close to the Ishimura train stations, so there's no excessive backtracking needed. The intensity director, designed to generate random audiovisual scares and necromorph attacks, does a great job, just so long as you don't push it too far. Your first run through an area is full of scripted encounters, but backtracking adds a degree of randomness that, if you go hunting for security doors each time your level increases, can lead to a Doom 3 style situation where every detour off the beaten path might consume as many resources as you gain. What the Intensity Director truly excels at is highlighting the overhauled visuals and incredible soundscape, often leaving you frantically aiming at every vent or stomping on every corpse just in case an infector appears. Now, as much as I enjoyed the updated movement, combat, and new content, I found myself longing for the classic gameplay loop. The original Dead Space may have refined the Resident Evil 4 experience, but it was still a game grounded in methodical, resource-centric gameplay. Cautious progression, retreating to defensible locations, preserving ammunition for your most powerful weapons, using necromorph limbs instead of ammunition, ensuring every shot counted. All these considerations felt essential, especially when playing on harder difficulties. In contrast, Dead Space 2023 often feels like a scrappier, action-oriented, shoot-first-think-later experience. Encounters ramp up in intensity sooner, tighter hitboxes mean more shots go wide, ammunition is doled out more readily, and it was only on the hardest difficulty, which makes Isaac incredibly fragile and the necromorphs bullet spongy, that I found myself concerned about supplies. On that note, despite the more frequent resource drops, the increased inventory space meant I never found myself having to make decisions about what to take and what to leave behind, or having to backtrack to restock. It's a more approachable design by modern standards, but I miss that classic, more methodical balance. If there's one consistently impressive element of Dead Space 2023 that I can only nitpick, it would be the updated environments and overhauled presentation. Motive have lovingly rebuilt the Ishimura in a way that feels respectful to the original, while also ensuring each deck is interconnected in a continuous, logical layout that only requires an initial load. Rebuilt from scratch in the Frostbite engine, the remake looks reasonably next-gen with stunning environments full of fine details, moving parts, and props galore. The new lighting, shadowing, and oppressive atmospheric effects add to the sense of dread, while the updated animations and character models retain the original designs, but add a new level of detail like a splattering of gore or a layer of frost on surfaces when in cold environments or a vacuum. I'll admit, I didn't find the layered gore and updated dismemberment system particularly impactful at first, until I picked up the force gun, blew a charging necromorph off its feet, and watched a bloodied skeleton with dangling limbs rise up from the ground for another round. When it comes to the audio, Dead Space 2008 still has an incredible soundscape, but the remake manages to improve upon it. In addition to just higher bitrate audio and quality voice acting, Anyone with the right software or hardware should immediately enable 3D audio for unsettlingly accurate, directional, and densely layered sound effects and ambience. Fighting through the Ishimura is an all-out assault on the ears, forcing you to cope with a cacophony of alien screeches, loud industrial hazards that can mask approaching necromorphs, and a dynamic soundtrack with a fondness for tension-building string pieces. That said, my favourite addition is the overhauled level layout that ramps up the immersion factor by making the Ishimura feel less like a game world. Almost all the important set-piece locations from the original return with an audiovisual overhaul, but I was most impressed by how they've been scaled up and connected. The tram system is now a central track, with mining and engineering decks to the rear of the vessel, cargo handling and hydroponics towards the midship, and the crew quarters and bridge towards the bow. Every viewing port or spacewalk now reveals the vast silhouette of the ship stretching into the void, giving the planet cracker an appropriate sense of scale. Isaac's initial route between lockdown decks now involves more service tunnels and the odd spacewalk, while many paths between important rooms have tweaked layouts or exist on separate levels. Despite the increased scale, intelligently placed shortcuts and twin tram platforms ensures you're never wasting time getting about. When you throw in the side missions and intensity director, it makes simple exploration feel both satisfying and nerve-wracking. At this point, I should probably note the slow door animations and elevator rides returned, but they serve an important purpose in generating tension and ensuring you never have a quick exit from danger. The only noticeable blemish I could think of is the somewhat last-gen looking human character models, and, subjectively, I'm not a fan of how the entire Ishimura feels grungy from the start. There was something striking about the contrast of bright red and yellow gore with the sterile, harshly lit starship environments of the original. In the remake, everything blends together in the grittier and gloomier environments. So, despite alternating between praise and criticism, Dead Space 2023 is the definitive experience for new and returning players, especially those that enjoyed the more action-focused sequel, or those who intend to move on to the sequels after playing this remake. It preserves and expands upon the original story, plays like a suitably modern third-person survival horror game, while the overhauled environments, visuals, and audio impress on new hardware. If you were after a modernized Dead Space experience and let down by the Callisto Protocol's attempt to be yet another cinematic blockbuster game, this is the remake you've been waiting for. On the other hand, if you love older, more methodical survival horror games, this remake doesn't render the original entirely obsolete. It doesn't dramatically change the characters or narrative trajectory. So, if you don't have access to a next-gen console or high-end PC, you can still consider this release a good excuse to pick up a dirt-cheap copy of the original Dead Space, as A, it still holds up in many ways, and B, it might encourage you to try the sequels as well. If you've got this far, please consider giving the video a like and maybe subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow.